Hello and welcome to the video analysis of the game Capablanca Tartakover. The position that we have in front of us is from one of Capablanca's more famous endgames. You may be familiar with it. It was played in the famous New York tournament in 1924, one of the two great events that happened in the 20s in New York, the super tournaments in 1924 and 1927. And both tournaments were covered in Alechin's book. He wrote a book on both events in New York. And if you have a chance, I would strongly recommend you get Alechin's book on both events and enjoy his comments on all the games in those events. So in this position, what do we have here? Well, it's a sharp endgame because white has certain weaknesses on the queen side, the pawn on a4 and the pawn on c3. But on the other hand, he has a very strong bishop on d3, which is looking in both directions. It is controlling the queen side, thus, for example, preventing a pawn advance by black there with a6 and b5, but also looking down the king side where white has a pawn majority. And in fact, this is a nice illustration of the superiority of the bishop over a knight in similar endgames where play happens on both sides of the board. So this superiority is shown in the bishop's ability to both support its own or its side's advance on one wing, in this case the king side, and also stop at the same time the opponent's play on the queen side, in this case the queen side, on the other side of the board. So having a pawn majority on the king side, now a logical way to continue is to try to make something out of it. So immediately a question: how would you continue here with white? How would you take immediate advantage of white's pawn majority on the king side? So maybe think a little bit, come up with some ideas, maybe calculate a line or two, and make your decision. So in this position, Capablanca played the move h5, which is an immediate way to start attacking black's king side by attacking that pawn on g6. The move is based on the relatively simple line, one move long. Again, justifying the advance is the fact that black cannot really take the pawn because g takes h5 after rook h1. It's not that white will only regain the pawn by rook h5 next, but he will also win a pawn because after rook takes on h5, the pawn on d5 and the pawn on h7 will be attacked, and black won't be able to defend both. So this one move long line is a justification for white's move h5. So since black cannot take and the pawn on g6 is hanging, he must defend it. So he plays rook f6, defending the pawn on g6, and after hg6 is a consistent way of continuing the plan. And we know that Capablanca was very consistent in pursuing his plans. This doesn't mean that there was no good alternative in this position. In fact, there was, and that was the move rook e1 check. So when the king moves, the rook can come to e5. It's a very strong position, centralized position of the rook on the e-file, attacking the pawn on d5. So this was a good alternative. But again, some typical for Capablanca, he was very consistent, very straightforward when he had a plan. So it's not surprising that he continues in this fashion by taking on g6, h takes g6, h takes g6, and rook h1. So he advanced h5, opened the h-file, and now he's taking over the h-file. So very consistent, very straightforward. After rook h1, now he wants to use the h-file to penetrate on the 7th or the 8th rank. And for example, if he puts the rook on h7, then he will be attacking the pawns, black's pawns on the queen side. Also, he can use the rook to further attack the pawn on g6, whether from h7, g7 or h6, depending on circumstances. So now black sees that he needs to defend his king side, and since the knight is too far away, he must use the king. So king f8. The immediate idea is, of course, to plug the entry points on the h file by playing king g7. So the immediate threat is king g7, and therefore it's clear that white must now, with his next move, he must use this opportunity to penetrate black's position. Now the only question is whether to do it from with rook h7 or rook h8. So again, a quick question for you. Compare. Try to calculate a little bit both moves, and then compare which one would you play if this were your own game. So again, the task is to calculate two candidate moves, rook h7, rook h8, and then compare them and come to a decision. In fact, this method that I just described, how to come to a decision, is one that you should be using always. Yeah? So there must be some structure in your thinking process. So I'll briefly describe this structure, how it should look like. So you have a position, yeah, and you make a selection of the candidate moves that look attractive to you. So you look at these candidate moves, then you calculate them one by one. At the end of the calculation of each candidate move, you must have a clear understanding of the final variation. It doesn't have to be an evaluation, I'm better, I'm worse, I'm a pawn up, or whatever. It can also be an evaluation that gives you a feeling about that final position. Oh, I like this, I don't feel comfortable here, I have an attack, I think this is promising or not. So anything that tells you whether you like to go in that direction or not. So this is very important, not always to stick to a fixed evaluation of I'm better, I'm worse, or something mathematical like I'm a pawn up or so on. It can also be a feeling, and very often these feelings are actually much more useful for understanding whether you like that variation or not really. So to continue, you form that evaluation, which can be a feeling, at the end of each candidate move that you calculate, and then you compare these feelings or evaluations, and consequently you choose the one that fits your own understanding, preference best. Yeah. Of course, if there is an objectively best variation from the candidate moves that you have calculated, you choose the objectively best one. Okay, if one leads to a clearly winning position with a piece up or something, of course you will choose that one. But when things are murky, when things are not exactly clear, you choose the line that you feel gives you best chances. And mind you, this is a very subjective process. If another person was sitting at the board with the same position and calculated the same variations, that person can have completely different feelings and choose a different line. Yeah. So this is very, very personal. And again, objectivity aside, nobody can really tell you where you feel most comfortable. So bear in mind this thought process that you should be trying to employ in your own games. So a bit of a explanation about thought processes here, but here it's actually again rather simplified because there is a choice of two moves, rook h7 or rook h8. So okay, pause a little bit, maybe think, and then decide. So Capablanca went with rook h7. This doesn't mean that the rook h8 move was worse. In fact, both are quite promising for white. And to illustrate the alternative, rook h8 check, king g7, and now rook d8, attacking that pawn on d5. So black cannot conveniently defend it because c6 is rather ugly, allowing rook d7 maybe, rook f7, rook d6 then, so it's a bit unpleasant for black, and also c6 robs black of the possibility to play rook c6 and counterattack the pawn on c3. So in fact, this is what he should do, rook c6 now, attacking the pawn on c3, and after rook takes d5, rook takes c3, bishop e4, escaping from the attack. We have a very, very sharp endgame here, because white is still trying to create a maybe passed pawn or an attack against the pawn on g6, but by letting the black rook become more active, he also has exposed his weaknesses. So for example, now both a4 and d4 are pawns that need defense. Still, objectively, white is better here. He has an advantage here. So most likely, Capablanca followed the process, the thought process I described, and when choosing between this variation with this sharp endgame and the one he played in the game, so let's go back to the position after king f8 and make the move Capablanca played rook h7, attacking these pawns on c7 and a7. After rook c6, which is the move he had to foresee, of course, defending the pawn on c7 and attacking on c3, he foresaw that he can actually play g4, and by playing so g4, he is advancing his own pawn majority, which is white's main plan here. Of course, he's a pawn up basically on the king side, so he tries to advance, and at the same time he curbs black's counterplay, because in this position taking that pawn on c3 is much worse, because unlike the line we considered after rook h8 check, here taking on c3 leads not to the loss of the pawn on d5 like in that variation, but to the loss of the pawn on g6. And this is of course much more favorable for white, because by taking on g6 he obtains two passed pawns which will quickly decide the issue. They are just marching forward, and they will create mating threats against black's king. Black on the other hand has these pawns which haven't really moved, so his counterplay is very, very far behind. So if we going back to the position after g4, we see that Capablanca chose the more restraining option when choosing between rook h7 and rook h8 check. So he compared both, and he chose the more restraining one, the one that prevents black from activating his rook by taking on c3 and creating this sharper version of this endgame. So he played g4. He had an alternative actually, and a curious one, because the echoes of this idea of king activation we will see a bit later in the game. He could have played king h3, for example. And again, the same idea, rook c3 is not very good because of bishop g6, and again, these two pawns are very strong. And on the other hand, the king wants to be activated via g4, g5, and so on. So he had an interesting alternative here. But, okay, going back to the move rook c6, he chose to go with g4. Again, it's a personal subjective choice. But again, I keep saying this, by understanding these subjective choices, we get to understand the player's style, the player's manner of play, the player's preferences, the player's methods, and also thought processes. So that is why it is so important to analyze the games of the great players. You get to understand them as players, because you analyze a lot of games, you get to see some patterns, which I'm hoping I'm explaining in this course. And by understanding all these patterns, their manners, their thought processes, you absorb them, you absorb their qualities, and you improve as a player. So this is the point of actually when everybody says, okay, you should analyze the games of great players. But this is why it is so important, to analyze those games. So to continue, since taking on c3 is not very good, what Tartakover does is he's finally activating the knight on the rim by getting it back into the game. He goes knight c4, and this introduces some ideas for him. He wants to activate the knight further. One idea is to go knight d2, knight d4 to centralize the knight and possibly plug the b1, h7 diagonal for white's bishop. Or the other idea is to give knight e3 check, and then from e3 the knight can go to d1, maybe attacking c3, or we will see in the game there is a possibility to jump to f5, especially after white's next move. And now, again, a curious moment. White has a choice. He can continue okay, maybe you want to think a little bit if you want. Again, I can prompt this moment where when there is a choice, you can think for yourself and compare then your choice to Capablanca's and also to my explanations. So yeah, if you want, you can pause. And the choice here for white is whether to continue with his plan straightforwardly, the plan that he started with pushing g5. He pushes g5 because he's fixing the pawn on g6 then, and that pawn can be attacked whether by rook h6, whereas if necessary he can always create the passed pawn with f5 next. But allowing playing g5 allows the knight to come to e3 and maybe to f5, yeah, or to stop the knight's activation via e3 and play a prophylactic move like king f2 by controlling that square on e3. Yeah. So again, there is a choice here for the type of play white can prefer. Yeah. So whether to prevent the activation or to pursue his own plan. And I think that is already here in this position that Capablanca foresaw the very, very cunning trap that he set with his next move after g5. Yeah. Because, but just to make it more clear, I will explain the trap on the next move. But just keep in mind that it was most likely in this position, because this is a major decision whether to allow this weakening of the f5 square or to prevent the knight activation with king f2. This is the moment for that decision, and I'm pretty sure he calculated the consequences in this exact situation. But okay, to make it clearer, let's move one move ahead. So g5, again, fixing the pawn on g6. The idea is to attack the pawn with maybe rook h6. f5 is also on the cards. And now, seeing the weakening of the f5 square, black plays the move knight e3 check. And here comes the crucial question. Where do you put the king? There are two alternative moves, yeah, to f3 or to g3. Where do you put it? And this is a very good exercise in calculation, because you have to, again, compare both options and to understand which one allows what and what are you willing to allow. Yeah, so one thing allows one thing, another thing allows another thing. So which one, you have to compare these options and then understand what are you more comfortable with allowing. Yeah. So maybe think a little bit, stop the video, yeah, calculate for yourself, and then we continue. So in this position, Capablanca, like I mentioned the move earlier, set a very, very, very subtle trap. I call it a trap, but okay, I think it is a trap. Because if you look at the position, black's last move, knight e3, introduces two ideas for black. Okay, one is to go knight f5, which is a great square for the knight. It just plugs the b1 h7 diagonal, ensures that the g6 pawn cannot be attacked anymore. So this is one idea. And the other idea is to go knight d1 and then go pawn grabbing with knight c3, then maybe the knight can come to e4 and so on. Yeah. So these are the two ideas. And what happened here is that if white wants to prevent knight f5, it is logical to play king g3. Why? Because now knight f5 is bad. Knight f5, bishop f5, g f5, and king h4. And then the king is getting very active, and this the king can come to h5, then g6 is allowed, king g5, pick up the pawn and winning easily because these two connected pawns are too strong, supported by the king. Yeah. So king g3 prevents knight f5. Of course, it allows knight d1, but knight d1 white cannot prevent. Following the same logic, king f3 appears that it gives black a choice. Now knight f5 appears possible, yeah, because then knight f5, g f5, the king cannot jump from f3 to h4, unfortunately, and the pawn on c3 is hanging with check. Yeah, knight d1 is still on the cards for black, but now he has a choice. Yeah, so again we see this psychological ploy, or again, I say trap, but it's more like an approach, a ploy, to give your opponent a choice, especially if you can calculate and see that one of the choices is actually a bad one. So he's giving him an extra choice of knight f5 in this variation. Yeah. But as we will see, it turns out that knight f5 is a mistake. So that's why I call it, this is a very, very subtle and deep trap, because the giving the opponent a choice which is not good for him is actually increases your chances of him falling into it. Yeah, especially if it's not very obvious. And here it is not obvious at all. And perhaps not surprising, or surprising if you will, Tartakova fell into the trap and he did play knight f5. And we will see Capablanca's very nice refutation. Before proceeding with the game continuation knight f5, let's check the better option, which was knight d1. And that was the way for black to continue, attacking the pawn on c3. And now the lines are very dangerous, in fact, for black. So maybe it's not surprising from that aspect that Tartakova chose the seemingly more solid option, more positional option, if you will. Knight f5, solidify the position. Okay, bishop f5 is not good because g5 and then rook c3 is coming with check. So it's it requires less calculation. Yeah? Whereas knight d1, things are very sharp. So for example, there are two promising lines for white, even though objectively black is fine in both. So one is the piece sacrifice, bishop g6. And after rook takes g6, rook c7. So the rook is defending that pawn on c3. The knight is stranded and out of play. The rook can pick up some more pawns on a7, and these two pawns are very scary, supported with the king g4, maybe king a5 or king g4 f5, and coming forward. And it appears very scary for black, and in practice this is probably difficult to defend. Yeah, even though it's just two pawns for the piece. So it appears scary, and okay, it's normal to be scared of such a variation. Another variation that is promising for white is what Alekhine mentioned in the tournament book, and that is, instead of the sacrifice on g6, there is a move rook h6, attacking the pawn on g6 twice, okay, by the bishop and the rook, king f7, and then now f5. So thanks to the pin along the 6th rank, the rook is not defended on c6. Black cannot take the pawn on f5, but he can take the pawn on c3. Rook c3, f takes g6, king g8, king e2, defending the bishop on d3 and attacking the knight on d1. And now this is the line that Alekhine mentioned in the tournament book, stating that it was very good for white. But in fact, there is an improvement here for black, and that is the very nice move knight f2. Yeah, the idea is that now a rook endgame after king f2, rook d3 is not scary for black at all, because with these double g pawns, white cannot achieve any progress on the king side. Therefore, he must escape with the bishop because it's attacked twice on d3, bishop f5, and now knight e4. So the knight just in time came back to the dominating position on e4, attacking the pawn on g5. And even though it still looks scary, the king appears lonesome on g8. There are ideas bishop e6 or rook h7 and so on. But analysis shows that black can survive here objectively, and he is fine. But again, just look at it. It's scary. You don't know during a game whether you can survive here or not. You need to continue calculating until reaching a definite conclusion, and this is not easy. Also, bear in mind, this was move 33, and maybe the players, especially Tartakova, were in time trouble. So it's not surprising that, from a practical point of view, that he did not want to embark on these lines with knight d1. So going back to the position after king f3, we saw that the lines after knight d1 require a lot of calculation. They look very unpleasant, scary for black. So from that practical point of view, it's not surprising that Tartakova chose the more solid looking move knight f5. So what's the big idea here? Well, It turns out that the logic that we were following so far, that the knight plugs the king side, bishop f5 is not very good because after gf5, rook c3 comes with a check, white loses a pawn and so on, is actually a flawed logic. And this is where my calling it a trap comes to the fore. Capablanca actually saw that not only with the king on g3, which was straightforward, with the king on g3, bishop f5, king h4, that's easy, but also with the king on f3, he can actually transpose to rook endgame with bishop takes f5, g takes f5, and king g3 now. So even a tempo down, and giving up a pawn on c3 with check, he understood, calculated, realized that the rook endgame is winning for him. And the reason for this is that this piece activity, the king, the pawn, the passed g pawn, and the active rook on h7 combine very nicely, coordinate very nicely, and are much more important than the material gains that black is actually obtaining by taking these pawns. And again, this very, very fine piece coordination, king h4, g6, king g5, king f6, all these white pieces coordinating harmoniously, is a very nice illustration of what Capablanca wrote in his book My Chess Career, where he wrote that to his understanding, the coordinated activity of pieces is the basic principle of the game of chess. So this is the core of the game of chess as a game. So coordinated activity, harmonious activity of the pieces. And here we see a beautiful illustration of that. So rook takes c3, king h4. And now, like I mentioned, the pawn comes to g6, the king is getting into black's position. King g5, king f6, threatening mating threats with rook h8, g7, and so on. So after rook f3 now, white is losing a second pawn, but again, the coordinate activity of the pieces is decisive and overweighs heavily even the loss of 2 pawns in a rook endgame. So g6, rook f4 check, king g5. So white is 2 pawns down. He can even be 3 pawns down, for example, in this position, if black takes on d4. But after rook d4, we have the most picturesque illustration, king f6, and just look, only 3 pieces, rook h7, pawn on g6, king f6, are worth more than black's 3 pawns. And here black is losing a full rook. The threat is rook h8 mate, but also g7, g8. And for example, king e8, now either the simple g7 and then g8, or rook h8 check and g8 winning a rook, or rook c7 again with the same idea, g7, g8. And when the rook comes to g4, then rook c8 check and g8 queen will decide the game, winning a full rook. So this line is a nice illustration of this coordinated activity of the pieces, this piece activity in the endgame. So going back to the position after king g5, the threat being king f6, black, meaning that black has no time to collect pawns, so he needs to start defending. So he goes to rook e4. The idea is to drop the rook back to the 8th rank and put the king on g8 when the pawn on g6 will not be able to promote. But after king f6, threatening mate on h8, king g8, black's problem is that now all the material gains he obtained, he will have to give back, and not only just give them back, but also with interest. He will lose actually a lot of pawns now. So king g8, now first rook g7. Of course, it was possible to take on c7, but Capablanca, as by now hopefully you have got used to, likes to worsen his opponent's position even a little bit if possible. So he first gives the check on g7, and after king h8, now he takes on c7, threatening mate on c8, but also now with the king on h8, if necessary, when the pawn advances g7, it will be with tempo, with check. So again, a small detail, but if possible, if it's a positive one for himself, why not have it at his disposal? So the threat is mate on c8, rook e8 is the only defense. And now white continues collecting pawns. So first king f5. And again, the difference in piece activity is the decisive factor. Look at white's pieces, king f5 and rook c7, compared to black's king h8 and rook e8. So it's clear that this piece activity will reap all rewards for white, his superior piece activity. Yeah? Under the threat of losing a lot of pawns, black goes rook e4, trying to counter-attack the pawn on d4. But okay, basically everything loses here for black. For example, playing a5, trying to keep the a pawn, will lose the b6 pawn after rook b7. And then the pawn b6 will fall, and most likely all the remaining pawns, rook b5, then a5 will hang, d5 will hang, and likely both will be lost. So Tartakova played rook e4, but now Capablanca forces him away from the attack on that pawn. He goes king f6, threatening mate again. Yeah, so if now the rook comes back to e8, then white can continue chopping off pawns, taking on a7. So Tartakova starts to give checks, rook f4, trying to push away the king from the vicinity of the g6 pawn in order to avoid the mating threats. But now the king goes to e5, of course, and wins the d5 pawn. The g pawn will not queen, because black's king is in front of it, but the d pawn will, because black cannot stop both. The king is cut off along the 7th rank and must stay in front of the g pawn, and there is nothing to prevent the harmonious and advance of the d pawn supported by white's king and rook. So rook g4, attacking the pawn on g6, and now we see that small detail coming to the fore, g7 check. Yeah, of course, the pawn endgame is hopeless, because after exchange on g7, white takes on d5, goes king c6, and the pawn will promote king c7, and the pawn will promote all the way to d8. Therefore, the king moves away, king g8, so you see g7 check, yeah, winning a tempo. That detail on move 40, when white played rook g7 check, well, now it was shown that it was a good decision. So king g8 and now rook a7. Calmly collecting more pawns. Yeah. Black's problem is that he cannot save the pawn on d5, because giving check on g5 after king f6 leads to mate. Rook a8, because the rook on g5 is hanging. Yeah. So cannot save the pawn, so he goes rook g1, but now it's just really elementary. King takes d5. Yeah. And notice, from being 2 pawns down at the beginning of the rook endgame, now white is 2 pawns up. So this is the huge difference in the activity of the pieces of both white and black, the difference it made. Yeah, from 2 pawns down to 2 pawns up. Yeah, this is how important this piece activity was. So the remaining moves are just dragging out the game. Rook c1, king d6, just advancing forward. Rook c2, d5. Just nothing really can stop white from advancing. Yeah, rook c1, rook c7, winning the c file so that the king can come to c6 and free the path for the pawn. Yeah, rook a1, king c6, rook takes a4, d6, and finally Tartakova resigned, because the pawn is just going forward. d7, d8, and if necessary rook c8 check and d8 queen, which will win a rook for white. So black resigned, and again, I think we saw a very nice illustration of this concept of piece activity in the endgame. Very, I think, subtle and deep trap for that Capablanca set for his opponent, and also psychological, nice psychological ploy on his part. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the analysis, yeah, and all the things I hopefully managed to explain in this video analysis. I thank you for watching it, and I'll see you in the next game. Hello, and welcome to the video analysis of the game Marshall Capablanca. In this position, we have a situation where black Capablanca is a pawn down. But he shouldn't really run the risk of losing the game, because his rook being attacked on d8 will naturally go to the second rank with rook d2, and he should be able to obtain more than enough activity to comfortably draw the game. So one would expect that, okay, activity should suffice, it should be a draw and so on, but surely white is not risking losing here, right? I mean, after all, he's a pawn up, and okay, he can maybe give one back and it should be a draw, right? However, starting from this moment, we will observe a very nice psychological, you could say, ploy that happens in the game. So you see, white is under the impression here that being a pawn up gives him the obligation, he feels under obligation to play for a win. And having the possibility to keep being a pawn up by defending the pawn on b2, and having this knight on c6 that is, let's say, blocking the bishop from b7, and perhaps if the rook from a8 moves, then the pawn on a7 is hanging. He has this feeling that he should try to play for a win. Now, what the problem is here is that this mindset of being fixated, I'm a pawn up, I must play for a win, yeah, can easily lead to underestimation of your opponent's activity, or in this case, black's activity. And therefore, it is also easy to pass over the moment without noticing when that activity becomes already threatening. And I spoke about shifting mentally in changing situations. When the situation changes on the board, and you should switch your mentality quickly to adapt to the new situation, is a very difficult thing for many players. And here's what we will see in this game too, that Marshall keeps playing with a pawn up, intending to play for a win, but then black's activity increases, it becomes threatening, and one by one he is missing these moments to force the draw. Then things start to become uncomfortable, the path to a draw is becoming more and more tricky, he keeps missing it, and eventually he collapses. So this is the scenario that we will see in this game, and it's a very common scenario when players are faced with piece activity or initiative, if you will. So that's why playing with the initiative is so unpleasant for the defending side. They have material, but it's difficult to judge when that initiative is more important than the material that the defending side is holding. So therefore, it requires very careful evaluation of the position and the changes in the position. When is the exact moment when the initiative is worth more than the material? Or vice versa, sometimes the initiative is not worth more than the material, and it pays to grab some material, defend for a while, extinguish the initiative, and convert. So these are very, very difficult aspects to judge in chess. And here we will see a very strong player, Frank Marshall. We already spoke about him when we analyzed the previous game between these two players. Was known as an attacking player himself, a player who enjoyed playing with an initiative, and here he found it difficult to navigate playing on the other side of the barricades. So the pawn on b2 is hanging, and it's curious that, for example, in his book Chess Fundamentals, Capablanca here calls white's move rook b1 as a big mistake. And of course, objectively, he's not right. Objectively, white is fine after rook b1, right? But psychologically, most likely he is, because of all this that I explained. White is putting himself in a defending position, and while for the time being he still has ways to perhaps give back material and liquidate to a drawn position, he slowly drifts into a position where the initiative becomes becomes more important. So Capablanca is right that he should not have, or maybe it was a more practical solution to kill off the game immediately. So for example, the line he gives in chess fundamentals is knight e7 check, king f8, rook c7, attacking the bishop on b7. Yeah? And after rook e8, rook takes b7, rook takes e7, rook b8, rook e8, rook b7, rook e7. We have a repetition of moves and a draw. So you see, the practically minded Capablanca and feels the importance of the initiative and how dangerous it can become for white. So he suggested in his comments that it's best to just kill it off immediately, save yourself the trouble, take the draw at once. But for this, one requires finely tuned understanding, finely tuned evaluation, and feeling for the initiative and the position. So, okay, again, as I mentioned, going back to the position after rook d2, Marshall played the move rook b1, defending the pawn. But again, I said it's white is still objectively fine here. So Capablanca plays rook e8, activating the rook, attacking the pawn on e4. And now, again, a tricky choice for white. So you see, on every move he's faced with this choice. Does he keep material, keep the game going, trying to somehow defend and convert, or liquidate and just make the draw immediately? And this division in the thoughts on every move, having given this choice, it's not an easy one. It's always like, do I just, okay, let's just draw. Yeah, okay, no, but maybe I can defend and then I can convert. So let's maybe try a move or two more to try to defend, and then maybe I can liquidate. But this division, this lack of clarity in the approach, what are you trying to achieve in a certain position, again, is divisive and never leads to good results. So for example, here, he had more than one way, of course, to liquidate. Yeah. Of course, f3 is not very good. Let's start with the not very good options. Yeah, f3 is not very good because after f5, black continues the attack on the pawn on e4, and white's problem is that he cannot take on f5 because after ef5, rook e2, he's being killed on the second rank. Yeah, the two rooks on the second rank dominate and just take everything. Yeah, so this is bad. But so after rook e8, good alternatives were, for example, knight takes a7. Yeah. Rook takes e4, yeah, let's say h3 opening a luft, rook e2, and now black will regain one pawn, the pawn, either on f2 or b2, but this will liquidate to a drawn position. Another idea after rook e8 is to abandon the pawn on b2, let's say rook bc1, yeah, and after bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, rook b2, obviously we have a double rook endgame with equal pawns, and again this should be a draw, especially maybe white can also go rook c8 and then play a rook endgame, pure rook endgame. Yeah. So again, this should be drawable for white. So after rook e8, again he has these choices to draw the game, but he insists. Okay, he's persistent. He wants to perhaps try a bit more. Yeah. So he plays the move e5, and again this is already tricky. This already makes this is actually the exact moment where the position passes from being easily drawable for white if he decides to give the pawn back to already becoming unpleasant. Still drawable, but on the unpleasant side. Not drawable on the comfortable side, but drawable on the unpleasant side. So this is the exact moment where the game crosses that line for white. Yeah, drawable but comfortable before, drawable but not really already now. So this is the exact moment when this changes. Yeah, and again it's very, very difficult to notice these nuances during a game. Yeah, when you analyze, when you understand, when you can explore options, you understand these things. Yeah, that's why analysis is so important. You can only unearth such understanding when you delve really deeply into the position. So again, e5, the idea is of course to have that pawn defended on e5. But notice that how white's pieces are all tied down. So look, the rook on b1 is tied to the defense of the pawn on b2. The rook on c3 is tied to the defense of the pawn of the knight on c6. The knight on c6 is glued to the c6 square because from there it is defending the pawn on e5. So none of white's pieces can actually move freely, compared to black's, whose activity is obviously apparent. So the rook on d2, rook on the second rank, we already know. It's very active, tying white down to the defense of the b2 pawn. The rook on e8 is attacking the pawn on e5. And the bishop on b7, even though, you could say is blocked by this knight on c6, is in fact very active because it forces the knight to stay there. Because if the knight moves, already the bishop becomes very active, and this will become a very important motive in the game. So having this situation, how would you continue with black? How do you continue playing here? What are the options? Think a little bit, consider some candidate moves, maybe calculate a line or two, maybe consider what white's idea can be here. Maybe you can do something about it and so on. So in case you considered perhaps what white's idea was, hopefully you came up with the prophylactic move that Capablanca played, and that is the move g5. And this is a very, very nice move. First of all, it deals with white's idea of f4. So if allowed, f4 would defend the pawn on e5 securely, and that would liberate the knight on c6. The second aspect of g5 is that it opens a luft for the king. So now there are no more backrack problems for black, and black can actually freely move the rook from the 8th rank, for example. A move like rook e6 becomes possible. And here, as I mentioned, the game becoming a bit still drawable, but on the unpleasant side. Let's just give you one sample line. Let's say a move like h3, not just giving up the idea on keeping the pawn, and let's say bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, and rook e5. Yeah. So double rook endgame, drawable, absolutely, but on the unpleasant side for white because black's rooks are more active. The immediate threat is rook e2, and then white runs the risk of losing one pawn. And again, most likely it will transpose to a rook endgame, a pawn down, theoretically drawn. For example, imagine one pair of rooks is exchanged. Black collects both pawns on the queen side, and white collects one pawn on the queen side. Yeah, and then there is just one extra pawn for black on the queen side, which is theoretically drawn, but it requires quite a bit of suffering. Yeah? So, as I said, drawable, but unpleasant, on the unpleasant side. So, going back after g5, Marshall continues to play ambitiously and plays the move h4, which immediately challenges that pawn on g5, and the idea being that he wants to remove the pawn on g5 in order to be able to play f4 again, if allowed. Yeah. So Capablanca takes the pawn, and this is not just regaining the extra pawn. It is also opens attacking possibilities for black because the pawn on h4 fixes that pawn on g2. And now suddenly the idea of rook e6, rook g6, introducing ideas like h3, attacking the knight on c6 one more time, suddenly creates very dangerous activity for black on the king side. Of course, putting the rook on g6, black will not blunder knight e7 fork. He will move the king first. But this idea of rook e6, rook g6 makes that pawn on h4 actually an attacking unit. Yeah? And here already, as we said, it's not pleasant for white anymore. And what he does next, I think, is already the decisive mistake. And I see it as a kind of a cheapo for white. Yeah? So what he does here is he plays the move rook e1, luring black to collect the pawns on the queen side with rook b2. But this is, like I said, a cheap trick that Capablanca deals with quite effectively. Before continuing with the game, it's worth pointing out that the path to safety here was far from easy for white, and it consisted in an attempt to secure the position of the knight on c6 with the move b4. The idea of b4 is to go b5 and just have this knight safely secured on c6, when white, of course, would be doing great because he would liberate the pawn, the rook from c3 as it can move and become active. Now again, black can transpose to this double rook endgame, bishop takes c6, rook e5. Here he's even already a pawn up thanks to that g takes h4, but this isolated structure on the king side makes it pretty problematic for him to be able to convert the advantage. Again, it's drawable for white, but unpleasant. Yeah, he's a pawn down, he has to defend and so on. Very difficult to adjust to this kind of play, being a pawn up, trying to play for a win somehow, to being a pawn down and trying to defend for a very long time. So an alternative for black after b4 is the move b5, which prevents white's idea of b5. And here the line is not really easy for white to see. That's why I said the path to a draw is no longer easy or straightforward. He should go a3, first remove the pawn from the second rank from being captured, and after rook a6, attacking the knight on c6, he gets an escape route via a5. Knight a5 with tempo, hitting the bishop, and after bishop d5, knight b3 is the saving idea. The knight is attacking the rook on d2 and threatens either knight c5 or knight d4. Yeah. And these threats make it force black to take the knight. So rook takes b3, rook cb3 for example, rook e5, and now something like rook f3 should be relatively easily drawable for white. Yeah, he's a pawn down, but like I said, the isolated structure on the queen side, on the king side for black, and the fact that the rook on f3 is very good defending the pawn on f2 and the pawn on a3, it makes the rook on b1 free to become active along the c file, and this should give white sufficient counterplay for a draw. So b4 was the key move for white to still save this game. Not easy, yeah. The lines are anything but obvious, so it's perhaps not surprising that Marshall didn't find it. But what he did, so going back to the position after g takes h4, what he did was, like I said, a cheapo, playing rook e1, and now a task for you to see, should black actually take those pawns on the queen side, rook b2, rook a2. Yeah, so it's something to calculate. It's a situation that happens in games very often. Your opponent is giving you something, so you should calculate and understand whether it's a trap, it's a sacrifice, or actually you can take those the material that is being offered. So think a little bit and see what your conclusion is. If you decide that you should not take those pawns, then think about what you should do instead. Capablanca correctly saw that taking the pawns was actually wrong, because after rook takes b2, knight takes a7, rook a2, white has the move knight b5. And now, even though he's a pawn down, he has this the knight becoming very active on d6. The knight is coming to d6, attacking the many black pieces. The rook on e8, the bishop on b7, and also targeting that pawn on f7, which can further be attacked maybe by rook c7, maybe by rook f3, yeah, attacking the pawn on f7. And this piece activity fully compensates the pawn deficit. Here, in fact, we have a reversal of the roles. If before that black was a pawn down but he had piece activity, here we have white being a pawn down, having piece activity himself. So having seen this line, Capablanca understood that he should not go pawn grabbing and he should continue playing with the initiative. And the initiative is basically following his plan. Rook e6. Yeah? We mentioned this idea thanks to that pawn on h4 and the open g file, that the rook on e6 is a very good piece, attacking the knight on c6 first and also introducing this idea of rook g6. And now, probably missed by Marshall, because now he admits the mistake, and the rook he just moved to e1. He moves it back to c1 to defend and keep the knight on c6. And to illustrate the dangers of letting the bishop b7 become active with knight takes e7, is illustrated with the line rook g6, attacking the pawn on g2, and after g3, h3, the bishop is indeed a monster on the long diagonal, and there are threats like h2 and mate, king h2, rook h6, rook h1, mate. Yeah. So again, this shows the dangers of what can happen to white if he allows all black's pieces to become extremely active, both rooks and the bishop. Therefore, Marshall wisely decides to keep the knight on c6 at all costs, and he goes rook e c1. Now, how does black continue now? How do you continue with the initiative? What do you do next? You probably understood that black wants to play rook g6, but that is not possible because of the fork knight e7. Prophylaxis, preparation of the move, rook g6, king g7. Yeah? Simple chess. Yeah? You want to play something, it's not possible, okay, so prepare it. King g7, avoiding any knight e7 checks and preparing rook g6. And only now Marshall comes to the idea of b4. Yeah? Unfortunately for him, too late. Yeah? b4 threatening b5, another prophylactic move, b5 played by Capablanca, preventing b5. And now if we want to compare the saving idea that we demonstrated on move 24, when b4 was still the saving resource for white, if we go along the same lines with knight a5, attacking the bishop on b7, bishop d5, knight b3, now we see the whole difference. Yes, the rook is attacked, but in that position, the pawn was already on a3, whereas here, black collects a free pawn on a2. So rook a2, and now let's say knight d4, rook e5, just collects too much material for black with a winning position. He's a pawn up, and again, he also has the superior bishop. The pawn on b4 is weak. G2 is still weak. Yeah, rook g5 is still an idea. So with a winning position for black, and this is illustration that the saving idea from before, getting the knight back to the game via a5, doesn't work here. So going back to the position after b5, Marshall played a3 instead, getting the pawn out of the second rank, and avoiding for it to be captured. Now he threatens knight a5 with the same idea as before, but of course Capablanca doesn't allow it. Rook g6, continuing the plan and pinning the knight on c6 forever, because white cannot allow black to take on g2. So what does white do now? Both rooks are not going anywhere. They are fixed. They're forced to stay on the c file, defending the knight on c6. There is also the threat of h3. So what Marshall does is king f1. He gets the king out of the g file, and now at least h3. After h3, he can take that pawn. And in this position, we have total domination by black. White can barely move. A good way to take advantage of such situations when your opponent cannot make any constructive moves is to make all the preparatory moves or useful moves in your position that you can. So in this position, for example, a move like a6 would have underlined white's helplessness. Yeah. However, what happened here is that in this position, Capablanca allowed an unnecessary chance to white. He played the move rook a2, which you could argue makes sense because, let's say, it moves away the rook from the attack by king e1 and also keeps an eye on the pawn on a3. So, for example, white cannot play a move like, let's say, rook c5 or something because the pawn on a3 would hang. But what the removal of the rook from the d file allows is a sudden tactical chance for white. So, tactical exercise in this position. How can white, let's even say, save the game here? What is this unexpected tactical chance that white got in this position? So think a little bit how white can go about confusing matters here and increase his chances to save the game. It is even in his book, in the comments to this game, that Capablanca mentioned the saving chance for white. And he wrote in his comments that here white's best chance was the move e6. You would say, what's happening here? Yeah? But if you saw the idea, congratulations. The point of the move e6 is that the natural move that white black wants to play, rook takes e6, is not possible because of knight d8. Yeah? Attacking the rook on e6 and the bishop on b7. And this is made possible because the rook is no longer on d2. It moved voluntarily to a2 and stopped controlling the d8 square. Yeah? This means that after e6, f takes e6, yeah, now severs black's control over black's connection of the rook on g6 to the knight on c6, and thanks to that pawn being on e6, yeah, and now white can actually play rook c2, forcing the exchange of rooks. Rook takes c2, rook takes c2, and freeing his position to a considerable extent. Yeah. Now, after something like king f6, the game will definitely continue, but white can definitely also breathe more freely here. Yeah? The knight is still perhaps pinned to c6, but there is no such pressure without two rooks. Yeah? White can maybe play f3, blunt the long diagonal, then the knight can move freely, and even though black is a pawn up, this disconnected structure on the king side where he is a pawn up makes it very, very difficult for him to convert. It's curious that in his comments, Capablanca wrote that even though e6 was a best move, this only would have prolonged the game. Yeah, but he did not really mention that it would have made it really difficult for him to convert the extra pawn, if at all possible. So going back to the position after rook a2, this unexpected chance was missed by Marshall. He played the really lame move, king g1. Again, a move that doesn't, in a way, accepting that he's doomed, because in the previous move he went king f1 to avoid problems on the g file, and now coming with the king back to g1, allowing, of course, h3, attacking the pawn on g2, and after g3 the problem is even worse for white because now the knight is deadly locked on c6 because of that h2 idea and rook h6, rook h1 mate. And in this position, Capablanca played the move a6 that we proposed a bit earlier with a, I think, a rare case of a zugzwang with so many pieces on the board. Literally, no white piece can move here. Yeah. So, for example, keeping the rook on the c file, like rook c5, is met by h2. Yeah, and the point is, or rook h6 threatening h2. Yeah. Yeah. The point of the immediate h2 is that after king h2, the rook f2 happens. Yeah. So king h2, rook f2. Yeah, and white's king side collapses. So after a6 being really, really short of constructive moves, it is only now that Marshall went e6, but this is already 2 moves too late. The point is that now black can take rook e6 and the saving move knight d8, which was saving white in the previous line, hitting the rook on e6 and the bishop on b7, here actually fails because of the open long diagonal, and black has the very nice intermezzo h2 check, forcing king h2, rook h6 check, king g1, and rook h8 or rook h1 mate. So you see how huge a difference the open long diagonal makes. Therefore, after rook e6, what white did is to move the rook from the g file so that he can play the move g4. The idea being to open some luft for the king, so maybe king h2, king g3, the king can be activated. Yeah, but Capablanca, well, doesn't allow it. Rook h6 now, threatening h2. Yeah, f3, blocking an attempt at least to block the long diagonal, but this weakens the second rank, and Capablanca takes immediate advantage of that by relocating the rook. So rook d6 threatening rook dd2. And now, after rook dd2, coupled with the pawn on h3, black will create a mating threat. Knight e7, now with the long diagonal blocked by the pawn on f3, the knight is free, but the knight was really a very, very unfortunate piece in this game, glued to the c6 square to keep the bishop on b7 out of play. And the moment it is released, the game is over, as its activity now cannot really make any difference. So rook dd2 threatening rook g2, and then mating threats. Knight f5 check, king f6, knight h4. So it appears the knight is just in time to defend the g2 square, but this is just only temporary for one move, because king g5 attacks that knight on h4 and forces it to go back to f5. So really very unfortunate piece for white, that knight on c6 that was, and now well, being forced out of h4. So knight f5, rook g2, check, king f1, because going to h1 is just a mate. Just to illustrate, king h1, rook h2, king g1, rook a g2, king f1, and rook h1 mate. It's a typical mating mechanism. And after rook g2 going to f1 just allows h2, and then the pawn promotes on the next move. Marshall gave one more check, f4, king f4, and here he resigned. So h1 or rook g1, both are threats, and he's completely lost, and he resigned. Very instructive endgame. Capablanca also wrote in his book that this endgame deserves careful study. And I think the reason for this is apart from showing the theme of importance of piece activity in the endgame, it also, I think, shows very nicely the psychology of playing with the initiative, playing against the initiative, what the players are experiencing when playing on both sides, with or against the initiative, the dilemma the defending player, let's say, faces, whether to extinguish the initiative by giving back the extra material, or trying to keep the extra material and try to extinguish the initiative and convert the advantage. So all these psychological aspects were very nicely illustrated in this game. I hope I managed to convey them, this gives you better understanding of these problems in your own games when they arise. I thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it instructional, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.